And for the last talk of this half, I present you another recording that we did with two amazing speakers who cannot be at this conference with us because they are traveling. Those are David Boyer and Grace Ann Rosile, founders of True Storytelling Institute and pioneers of narrative technology. They are going to share what is a conversational storytelling interview and how, through listening, deeply listening to the stories, even the stories we disagree inside us and outside us, we can build new bridges. So I leave you with that, and here's the recording we did. Hope you enjoy.
Hello, I'm Grace Ann Rosile. I'm a professor emeritus of management at New Mexico State University. And with me is my husband and colleague, David Bogie. David?
Hi, I'm David.
David is also professor emeritus of management, distinguished professor, whatever. I don't remember his whole title. So today we're going to talk about storytelling in the context of change, both individual and organizational. So our approach to storytelling and change is rooted in what's called narrative therapy restorying. And David and I both had been using storytelling in groups to help analyze problems and come up with solutions by deconstructing the story. And if you read Epston and White, you'll find out that, yes, deconstructing the story is basically the underlying secret sauce for using storytelling for changing your story. So what we have done is we're going to talk today about a way of interviewing people, which we call conversational storytelling interviews, that turn interviews, which can be interrogation-like, and instead make them more collaborative and friendlier mutual storytelling, conversational storytelling. And then the other thing we're going to talk about today is how we use the ensemble processes of storytelling, so that David calls them together telling. Ways, many ways, not just storytelling, but the material ways, the economic ways that we can tell a story together and co-create a story. So those two methods, conversational storytelling, interviewing, and the ensemble process of together telling will take us through the restoring at the organizational level. I'll tell you first just a little bit about conversational storytelling interviewing. So as I said, we want to get away from that idea of an interview being an interrogation. Instead, we want to make it a back and forth. And David usually reminds us that when we were in New Zealand, one of our Maori doctoral students explained to us that it is their tradition that when they interview someone, talk with someone, that it is more like a conversation because the person interviewing brings the gift of their own story and offers it in exchange, and then there's a sharing and an exchange of stories. So we like that model of calling it a Maori tradition, which it is. And so on conversational storytelling interviewing, unlike many of us were trained in academic programs to be objective and stand back and not interfere and that sort of thing, this is more of an equal sharing. So I'm just going to tell you briefly, we do have the book on conversational storytelling interviewing. If you want more of the academic justification for it, as well as tips on how to do it. The main thing I want to emphasize now is that it's very sort of anthropological. It very much involves observing, listening and observing, so that we hear what the other person is saying and we notice everything about their body language and the context of their story. So we want to listen carefully and observe. And one of the things that we recommend too is to not be too focused on your own schedule of what you should be doing, and instead be open to where the intersection of stories takes you. So it might go in a different direction. And as you know, in casual conversations, we allow people to diverge and come back. And in this setting, those divergences can provide very important information in the process that we want to look at. And so we want to pay attention and be open to the shared stories taking us where they want to go, to some extent, really. So when we're observing all of these things, what we want to do is to think of the restorying process. And so in restorying, we take our stories, and after we've shared stories, we want to look at how do we characterize ourselves or the people in the story. In a minute, I'm going to take that to the organizational level, but I'll go through the individual level first. So we characterize the ideal self, ourselves at our best. We externalize the problem, not as something about me or something about that awful person out there, but instead its own character. We sympathize, and sometimes this is overlooked, with what are the good parts of the problem situation that we want to look at. It has evolved because there was some need and some support for that situation to arise and to persist. So we want to be aware of what are those important benefits of the problem. And then we want to go back and revise, okay, maybe we had the benefits, but now we have some issues. And so what are these bad outcomes? Revise that story of the good outcomes and look at what's the negative side of that. Then we move to the fifth step, strategize. And this is where the kind of the crux of using this approach comes in. We want to look at when was there in the past a unique outcome, or what David calls a little wow moment, when we were successful in overcoming this type of situation, or at least we saw the potential where we might have chosen a different path and been successful. So we look at that positive side. Then we go back and rehistoricize, and we take that lost story of our success in dealing with the problem, and we make that the dominant story. And we retell the history, emphasizing those positive features of that wow moment. The final step is to publicize and enlist the support of our network. And this helps to establish and perpetuate the change that we're looking for. So that's how we do it at the individual level. It also works almost identically at the organizational level. What we have done is involved what we call ensemble storytelling, group processes into this restoring process, and we find that it works quite well. And David will give you some examples of it. So at the organizational level, we characterize the organization, we externalize the problem, we look at the good things that maybe it worked in the past, maybe it worked in certain contexts, the good aspects of this problem situation. We revise and say, well, now what are the negative things and what are the disadvantages of this particular issue? We find the wow moment. Organizationally, we find the wow moment, the unique outcome from the past. And then we retell the history, and we emphasized those lost moments where we forgot that we were successful at contending with this issue, this problem, overcoming that externalized character. And then we publicize our new way of bringing that lost story of success to be the dominant story, the new normal. How do we manage these things? I'll give you a very brief example from my own experience. I was a professor for many years and only recently retired, and we still teach some. But I had been, years ago, I'd been required in my business policy and strategy class to use the same textbook everyone else used and the same format. I typically did not use multiple choice questions, but this was a requirement of the department, so I adapted. And I was very careful in how I constructed my exams. I had usually 8 different versions of each multiple choice exam with about 1/3 different items on there in a different order and a different color for the exam, and all of these extensive precautions so that no one would cheat on the exam. What I also did was I posted in the hallway the versions that that group had along with their answers. And when they took the exam, they got a little square, half the size of a note card, piece of paper that allowed them to record their answers. And it was in color coded, and they could take that piece of paper with them when they left the room and check their answers right there. They could see the question, see the correct answer, see on their little sheet of paper, and know their score when they left and know the correct answer when they left the room. I was really proud of this system. I thought reinforce the positive knowledge when they're most interested in finding out what the answer is. And so it seemed to work very well until technology intervened. And what happened was, and this is about 10 years ago, wasn't just cell phones, which I didn't even own a cell phone at the time. It was text messaging. And so this was like the first year. I think it had started the spring before, and this was the fall. And students had this thing called text messaging, which, of course, again, I had never heard of. I didn't even have a cell phone. So during the exam, I would hear these little pings. And I thought, well, but nobody's on a phone. I don't see any phones up to the ears. So I ignored it. Through the grapevine, somebody through a thin office wall heard some of the students saying that people were cheating in my class. And we discovered that they were using text messaging. So yeah, the phones were pinging, but they were under the desk, inside a coat or something. And I didn't see it. Long story short, I decided that I would post false answers so that we would prosecute only the students who actually cheated. And the ones who were honest students wouldn't be falsely charged or questioned. So we did that. I ended up failing 9 seniors in a class of 44. They did not graduate. They had to tell their parents to cancel their trips to campus. It was a mess. And it took me all of the semester to process the charges and the bureaucracy that you go through and all of that. However, the part that's important for this is that when this started happening, I explained to you how I had taken every precaution to prevent cheating so that I wouldn't have to deal with things like this. And then I discovered, as I said, technology circumvented all my brilliant strategies, and I was faced with being the evil professor who had to punish these hardworking students. And the story I found myself in was that I was the evil professor, and on top of that, they were the bad students. And I never like to think of my students as the, I'm not a person who complains about how awful they are and they get worse year to year and all of those kind of things. I like to see that they are like I was, hardworking, trying to get along, and sometimes susceptible to temptations to cheat and things, but basically honest, hardworking students. But I was stuck in this other story. So how was I to get out of it? And in interviewing the students, one of the students said to me, I won't tell you who helped me to cheat because he's a good guy. He's my friend, and I won't tell you who it is. I'm not ratting out my friend. I felt even worse. I had visions of those old Gestapo movies of tell us, and torturing people and that sort of thing. And it took me a while to figure out, how can I change this story? So think about this for a minute. If you were faced with that same situation and you had clear evidence that this student cheated and clear evidence that someone else helped them to be able to use this cell phone technology to cheat, what would you say to them about, I don't want to rat out my friend? And I thought, I don't want to tell them to rat out their friend. So I ended that interview, and I thought about this over the weekend. And previous weekend, I had spent a whole weekend thinking about, was I going to post the false answers, which I subsequently did. And that was a whole process too, but for another restoring example. So the student who said I didn't want to rat out my friend, how can we restore this and avoid being the bad guy, the villain, or making them the villain? So I looked at, what's the story here? The story among all the students that I interviewed who had the set of false answers was that this is nobody's problem but mine. It's nobody's business but mine. And it doesn't hurt anybody but me. So why should anybody care? And there were other stories that it's not such a big deal. Everybody does it. That's another common storyline, that everybody cheats. I had a session with my class, and one of the first steps of what we call true storytelling is to be honest yourself. You have to really I looked at how do I feel about people who cheat, and what can I do about this, and what's the story that I want to create. And so I had a session with the class. I told them my views on ethics and cheating from when I was 3 years old. And my dad caught me doing something, and I said, no, I didn't do that. So how did that affect how I think about ethics in the story that I told? And how I felt about cheating in the university and in the school system. I told them the story of sitting in class one day and thinking, if someone told me, I was maybe 13 years old, and I remember distinctly the sun shining in the window, and I thought, if someone said, you have 1 year to live, what would I do? And I realized I would want to be where I was, because I thought it was so much fun to learn new things. And so school meant something to me, and learning meant something to me. So then I asked them, I told them that we had this situation with cheating. And personally, I felt very hurt that students cheat. But I wanted their views on what had happened. The students had already been removed from the class that I interviewed and went through the whole process. So then I typed a summary of the comments that they all wrote, and I put them in one document. It was 2 pages, single spaced, and I passed it out in class. and I showed them this document. And I asked them, what did they think? They stood up and told their personal stories of how they felt about cheating. And one of the things that I had mentioned to them was there's a lot of literature that says that everybody cheats, that 60 to 80% of students admit to having cheated in their college career, and some estimates as high as 95%. And of course, this is a business college. Business students were only beat by the journalism students for the rate of acknowledging cheating. And so we had discussed all of this stuff. When they looked at what their classmates said about cheating, their classmates said, we think this is awful. I stayed up all night studying. I don't think failing the class is enough of a penalty. They should be thrown out of the university. So here we saw that the honest students said they valued their honesty and they did not approve of students who cheated, and they saw how it could hurt them too. We had talked about the reputation of the school, and we talked about how I had talked about how I knew of cases where, in one example, an engineering student was known to have cheated their way through school. And when it came time to be voted into the Professional Engineers Society after graduation, everybody in this small town knew that history. And so they didn't get voted in. So anyway, the whole thing of it doesn't hurt anybody else is a false story too. After sharing these stories and realizing that we all valued integrity and that some of us were the oblivious one that didn't do anything and continued to promote that, this ensemble story process allowed us to co-create a new story of valuing academic integrity. And we looked at it that way, that it was this attitude that it's not your business, it's this thief in the night of a cheater. And instead, we wanted to create a culture of academic integrity where we all helped each other maintain that. And the answer to the student who didn't want to rat out his friend is, if you were really a friend, wouldn't you help that friend be honest and take the better path and support them in their ability and your faith in them to do the right thing? So at the end, the honest students thanked me for sticking up for them at the end of the semester. And we had a good end of the semester. People were happy. And one final little story, in copying the exams at the end of the year, somehow the answer sheet got into some, but not all, of the exams. And I still can't figure out how it happened that it only got into some. So while they're taking the final exam, I see students looking puzzled and starting to look around, and I thought, oh no, they're not cheating again, are they? Well, in a few minutes, a student came up to me and he showed me the answer sheet and he said, is this supposed to be here? And I said, of course not. I don't know how that happened. So everybody in the room saw what was happening and they all laughed. And the ones who had answer sheets turned them in and they said they thought this was another test to see if we were going to be honest. So we changed the story. David, I didn't give you a chance to give your example, organizational example.
Well, thank you, Grace Ann. One of the things about Grace Ann's story is she got an integrity award at a conference on ethics, and I'm quite proud of her for that. And the other thing is the example she gave is both a personal example of restoring the whole system. It's got conversational storytelling in it. And it's an institutional story because you can't fight cheating if the institution says that it allows cheating. Because sometimes when I was a department head, the students would bring in a lawyer if you accuse them of cheating, or they bring in their mother and father, and you'd have to deal with that. And without an institution to back you up, most of the time, the higher-ups would just fold. Let me think if I can think of an example of the restoring for you. So you'll notice the photograph that goes with our presentation has a bell in it. So here I have a bell. And Grace Ann and I got to ring that bell, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But let's back up in the beginning, how the restoring happened. Last time I presented with you all, I didn't know I had stage 4 cancer in 3 different places, prostate, and it had migrated into lymph nodes and was very aggressive. And I had a lymph node, or I had kidney cancer, not so aggressive. So I thought I just had a very short time to live. And the question was, how am I going to carry myself? What am I going to do during this time of getting treatments? My case was radiation treatments. So I thought about it, and I was actually working with a therapist, which I really recommend if you have cancer, because you go through a lot of emotional roller coasters, And during a meditation session, I had this image of a little Buddha. And the little Buddha it looked just like this, just a little baby Buddha. And he knows how it's smiling and it's looking up and it's so joyful. I said, that's what I want. I want to go through my cancer treatments like that. And so that was the sort of the restoring, was I was going to create little wow moments of joy, of finding moments of joy in the whole process of the treatments. And I would remember those times when I had gone through trials and I had, maybe the trial was overwhelming me, but I found a moment when there was a little wow moment. So the little Buddha, instead of fighting the cancer and having somebody, the symbol like combating the cancer, a lot of people do that. I said, well, I'm going to make cancer my friend. I'm going to invite cancer cells, billions of them, to leave my body. And I'm going to recognize that it's a natural part of life. And that's what I did. So now I'm here, and I guess you'd say cancer-free, or at least it's unmeasurable after about a year. And so I went through this amazing journey. And at the end of the journey, they invited us after the 28 radiation therapy sessions to go in the hall, ring a bell, take a photo with the staff and my dear wife, Grace Ann. And we were very joyful at coming through the experience. So that's one story for you. Okay? I'll turn it back to Grace Ann.
So David, did you want to tell some of the organizational stories? So in translating, restoring from the individual level to the organizational level, we use some ensemble processes. And did you want to give some example of that, David?
Sure. Here's one that's, I think, quite interesting in the medical field. Grace Ann and I had a chance to work with a hospital, and the staff of the hospital, very progressive. They'd already done a number of good things to improve doctor and nurse relationships, and very, very good. And the consultant we were working with, Mr. Webb, he had already done something I want to share with you, and we extended it. We had the people in the hospital, the administrators and the doctors and the nurses, check into the hospital and become patients for the night. So they got to be in those, they go through the check-in procedure, which they found very bureaucratic, overly so. They got to go in these rooms with all these tubes and machinery hanging around, and they thought that was really not the kind of place they wanted to stay the night. And then they had a crinkling pillow and the crinkling pillow was, there was plastic wrap around the pillow. Well, they couldn't sleep very well, and they were talking about it, debriefing the next day, and they said, well, we couldn't sleep. And what's with the plastic around the pillow? Is that like a medical law that you have to have plastic around the pillows? Is it some sort of barrier for germs? And the doctor says, I don't think so. And so they found out that maintenance had put in the pillows about 8 years ago and didn't take the plastic off. And then each succession time they replaced pillows, they left the plastic on, thinking that's what it was. So they made a number of changes. They didn't like the food either. They thought, this is terrible food. I would never eat here. And most of them didn't eat at the cafeteria. So they hired a chef. They took the plastic off the pillows. They hung up pictures on the wall. They put curtains and blinds around this machinery and the tubes. And now this place is the best place to go in the city for a meal. And what we did, we helped the chef get a bigger space because now the place is so popular to eat at with the local seating there that we're not sick, that the chef wanted to expand his facility and get some help and maintain having the best food in the city. Anyway, so when you experience the material fabric of the problem situation yourself, you don't have to spend a lot of words, but you don't have to do a lot of words. They experience it in an embodied way. Grace Ann, is that a good example for you?
Excellent. And we carried that through in a workshop where we had them do little tableaus and little skits of what they felt were issues. And then they could physically embody what they saw going on. And so we carried that into a workshop setting. And you remember the one set of people had the doctor standing up looking disapproving and the nurse kneeling down imploring forgiveness for putting the wrong chair where it was supposed to be. And so that elicited quite a discussion.
Yeah, why don't you explain what ensemble leadership is, and then we'll segue into the CIW.
So I think David mentioned that last time we were at this wonderful conference that Artem organizes, that we talked about ensemble leadership. So I want to make the connection between ensemble leadership and storytelling for change. Because what we found when we studied the CIW, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, they have been singularly successful at eradicating slavery in the workplace. And their workplace is remote fields where there are nobody's around to oversee what they're doing, and there are a lot of abuses. And so this group received the Presidential Award for their success in overcoming enslavement practices. And they also just received was it a MacArthur Genius Grant? Well, they had that before. Now they got also, on top of that, just this past year, a Department of Labor grant to extend their methods to other industries and other countries. And so this ensemble process, we think, is very important and very effective, especially when it's used, as the CIW uses it, to incorporate worker voices into the change initiatives in the workplace. And so what they've found is that by incorporating the worker's voice, you have much more effective means of monitoring human resource practices and other kinds of supply chain behaviors and potential abuses in the workplace. So what we saw at the CIW was their many ways of leading through. Their motto is, we are all leaders. And so essentially, they're using ensemble processes, collaborative, integrative, inclusive processes of storytelling, so that the story, and this is one important aspect of individual level narrative therapy part, is that when they start this process, they say, even to a child, is it okay to talk about this now? They ask permission, because it should always be the client's story. They are the focus. Now with conversational storytelling, we are balanced more, but we have to remember that by coming in with our story and our agenda, we take away the stage and the voice of the person we're interviewing. So at the CIW, we saw many ways we have an article on ensemble leadership and ensemble storytelling. We are presenting this at the Academy of Management in August. We're featured by 3 different divisions. So this method of ensemble storytelling is very powerful and very effective, especially when it crosses the boundaries of workers and management and helps workers have a voice in management. And so their training involves the workers telling their own stories. It involves evocative pictures, so that we have a physical depiction of something, and they use non-directive kinds of approaches, like saying, what do you see here? And they share their stories. Now, it's very interesting that one of the things that happened when we were all down there in Immokalee, Florida, and they were having their community meeting on a Thursday night, I think it was, and we sat down at a big table as community people were coming in and joining the group. They came over to us and said, would you mind standing back from the table? And I realized that the start had been fairly slow. People were coming in but seemed reluctant to speak. But as we stood back behind them, and the local people took all the chairs at the table, it was a big rectangular set of tables set in the rectangular shape. Our presence, clearly we were not field workers. We were all academics, about 6 of us there. Must have put a damper on the participation that they usually had. So after we stepped back and people sat down, again, still it was a little bit slow in people telling their stories. So what they did was they started with, what was it like in the old days? And so some of the old timers started, oh, remember when they did this, and then we had this improvement. Remember when that happened, and we had the other kind of improvement. Remember when they would not give us our wages and claim we had to wait. And then the CIW made them accountable. After they told the stories of the bad old days and how it had improved, then people started to pipe up and say, I think one of the things we should address next is, and they would go on. Of course, they were most likely speaking in Spanish. And every time someone spoke in Spanish, they took the time for someone to translate. So the speaking up, the making room, making the space by removing us authority figures, intimidating figures from the table, literally. They encouraged people to speak and make their voices heard. And that has certainly been a key to their success.
Well, our time is up, our 1 minute egg timer. There's no time left in it. So we wish everybody at the conference a wonderful event, and be developing those bridge stories with one another. Anything you want to comment on, Grace Ann?
I want to thank Artem for being such a great person and a great organizer for this conference. And hope that by telling our stories, we can promote greater understanding. And as he said, to overcome the barriers and the borders that seem to separate us. Thank you.